One shooter's down. There may be a second.
He stopped them! That's the guy who saved people!
Shut up! Back up! North corridor, dark hoodie, ball cap. Moving against evac. Check cameras.
Stop resisting!
You're pinning the wrong man while you ignore the only lead you've got.
Don't grab my tile scrape! I'm complying!
This is why you need to know your rights. When police rushed into that mall after the shooting stopped, they should have secured the scene, checked the threat, and listened to witnesses. Instead, one officer picked the wrong man, forced him to the ground, and turned a life-saving intervention into a constitutional violation. Stay with this one, because the moment he realized who he had in cuffs, his authority started falling apart in real time. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about rights, accountability, and people keeping control while everyone else loses theirs, like the video and subscribe. Officer Tyler Grayson entered the east corridor of Ridgeway Mall a few minutes after the first shots had sent people running. The worst part of the attack was already over by then. The gunman was down near the food court entrance. Shoppers were hiding behind planters, kiosks, and flipped tables. Some were crying. Some were calling family, some were recording. Store alarms were going off. A stroller sat on its side near a pretzel stand. The scene was loud, confused, and dangerous. But the shooter had already been stopped. The man who stopped him was Marcus Hale. Marcus wasn't acting wild. He wasn't holding people at gunpoint. He wasn't shouting over the crowd. His weapon was holstered. He was standing a few feet from the downed attacker, watching the corridor, the exits, and the movement around him. He had already pushed civilians toward cover and away from the open line of fire. He was doing what trained people do after a threat drops. He was checking for the next problem. Witnesses were already yelling that Marcus had saved lives. Grayson ignored them. He saw a man near a body and decided that was enough. He moved straight in, closed distance fast, and tackled Marcus to the ground before getting a clear read on the scene. Several people started shouting at once. They were trying to tell him he had the wrong man. One woman screamed that Marcus had pulled her little boy behind cover. A store employee pointed at the shooter and tried to explain what happened. An older man kept saying the same thing over and over, that the man on the ground was the one who stopped it. Grayson stayed locked on Marcus. That's where he lost control of the scene. Not because he lacked information, because he refused to use it. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't swing, twist, or argue in panic. He tried to explain the situation while Grayson pinned him down. He said the shooter was already neutralized. He said there could be another involved person moving towards the north exit. He said his identification was in his back pocket. He told the officer to stop wrenching his left arm because he had recently had shoulder surgery. Grayson didn't slow down. He forced Marcus's arm higher behind his back and drove a knee into him while reaching for the cuffs. Marcus repeated the warning about the shoulder. Grayson kept going. That was one problem. The other problem was bigger. While he was busy dominating the wrong man, he wasn't following the only useful lead he had at that moment. Marcus was trying to tell him there might be a second person connected to the shooter. Grayson treated that like an excuse instead of operational information. That decision changed the scene. Marcus had come to the mall for a simple errand. He was home on temporary leave and had stopped to buy a gift for his sister before meeting family later that afternoon. He wasn't looking for trouble. According to later witness statements, the gunman entered through the food court side carrying a rifle and opened fire into a weekend crowd. Marcus moved on instinct. He pulled people out of the line of fire, used available cover, identified the attacker, and stopped him before the casualty count got worse. Then he did what mattered next. He scanned for anything connected to the first threat. That's what Grayson interrupted. Pinned on the tile, Marcus kept his voice level and kept trying to give information. He described a man moving against the flow of evacuees seconds before the shooting. Dark hoodie, ball cap, quick movement, possible eye contact with the shooter before the first round went off. Marcus wasn't claiming he had a full case built in 30 seconds. He was saying there was enough to lock down that side of the mall and check cameras immediately. Grayson answered with threats. He said Marcus was looking at felony charges. He accused him of interfering. He said he'd sort out the story later. That told everyone around him exactly what kind of officer he was in that moment. He wasn't trying to understand what happened. He was trying to win the encounter. More officers arrived and took their cue from him. That made things worse. One officer moved to help secure Marcus instead of checking the area around the downed shooter. Another started pushing witnesses back without taking real statements. A third looked uncertain for a second when Marcus repeated the warning about another possible subject. But Grayson kept control of the contact and pushed forward like nothing around him mattered. This is how bad police work spreads. One wrong assumption, then other people start working inside it. Marcus stayed controlled. He repeated that his weapon was holstered. He repeated that witnesses could confirm what happened. He repeated that his ID was in his pocket. He repeated that the North Corridor needed attention. He gave the officer every chance to correct the mistake early. Grayson didn't take it. Instead, he started searching Marcus more aggressively. He went through his pockets without listening and without any sign that he understood the legal or tactical mess he was creating. Phones were pointed at him from 3 directions now. People were filming. The crowd wasn't confused anymore. They could see exactly what was happening. A man who had stopped a shooter was being treated like the threat, while the officer ignored everyone telling him otherwise. Then Grayson pulled out Marcus's wallet. Inside was a credential holder that didn't match the picture Grayson had built in his head. It wasn't just a driver's license and a carry permit. There was military identification, base access documentation. Then there was one more credential, specialized official, the kind of thing that should have made him stop and reassess immediately. He hesitated, not long enough. He looked at it, then kept trying to control the scene like he hadn't just found proof that the man under him was not who he had assumed. That hesitation was the first visible crack. He still didn't want to admit he had made a serious mistake. He was standing on authority, and he wasn't ready to let go of it. Then Sergeant Elena Ruiz arrived. Ruiz had enough experience to read a scene quickly. She saw the downed shooter. She saw the witness reactions. She saw Marcus cuffed on the floor. She saw Grayson holding credentials with a look that told her he was already in deeper than he understood. She took the wallet from his hand, looked through it once. Then she looked at Marcus and recognized the name. Not because Marcus was famous, because she had seen it before in interagency training and emergency coordination briefings. She knew exactly what kind of operator he was dealing with. She also knew that if he was calm, compliant, and giving live threat information, then Grayson had likely just made one of the worst decisions of his career. Ruiz ordered the cuffs off immediately. Grayson started explaining. He said he had to secure the armed subject first. He said he was following protocol. He said he couldn't take chances. Ruiz wasn't buying it. The facts in front of her were too clear. Marcus had complied. Witnesses had identified him. His weapon had been holstered. He had been trying to provide tactical information. Grayson had ignored all of it. Once the cuffs came off, Marcus got to his feet carefully and checked his left shoulder. One of the other officers moved towards the North Corridor at last. Another started separating witnesses for statements. Ruiz asked Marcus for the threat picture. He gave it to her without attitude and without speech-making. He explained that the shooter had shown signs of coordination before the attack. He described the possible second person again. He explained the movement, the timing, and why the exit route needed immediate review. He made clear he wasn't speculating for attention. He was telling them what he had seen while stopping the gunman. Then he made the point that hit hardest. He told Ruiz that Grayson hadn't just detained the wrong man. He had interrupted the one person on scene who was actively tracking the rest of the threat. That changed the tone around everyone standing there. Now, the issue wasn't just a bad detention. It was operational failure during an active shooter response. Witnesses had seen it. Bodycam had captured it. Civilian phones had captured it. Mall cameras had captured it. There was no clean way to explain it away. Ruiz immediately split the response the way it should have been split from the beginning. Officers were sent to check the north side exits and pull surveillance. Witnesses were held for proper interviews. The area around the shooter was resecured. EEMS was directed toward injured civilians and towards Marcus's shoulder. Command staff started getting updated information that actually matched the scene. Grayson had gone quiet by then. The confidence was gone. The threats were gone. He looked like a man realizing that every wrong choice he had made was now attached to video, reports, witnesses, and a chain of command much bigger than his own department. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to humiliate him. He just told Ruiz he would fully cooperate and that the footage would show everything. That was enough. Because once a case like this leaves the heat of the moment and moves into review, the loud officer usually has the weakest position. And Grayson had just handed reviewers everything they needed. Once supervisors reviewed the body cam, the issue changed fast. This was no longer just a bad scene decision. It was a force complaint, a rights violation, and a response failure caught from multiple angles. Marcus gave a statement that evening. He kept it simple. He explained where he was, how he stopped the shooter, what he saw before the attack, and what he told Officer Grayson while he was on the ground. He also documented the shoulder injury, recent surgery, clear warning given, force still used. The witnesses backed him up. The mother with the stroller said Marcus pulled her child to cover. The store employee said Marcus was scanning exits, not threatening anyone, when police arrived. The off-duty nurse said Marcus kept trying to warn Grayson about another possible subject. A teenage worker said the same thing. On video, the crowd could be heard telling Grayson he had the wrong man. That hurt Grayson immediately. He couldn't claim he had no information. He had plenty. He ignored it. Mall surveillance made it worse. Investigators pulled footage from the food court and north exit. It showed a man matching Marcus's description, moving away during the panic after what looked like brief pre-attack coordination with the shooter. That didn't prove a full second shooter yet, but it proved Marcus had given a real lead. Grayson had chosen not to act on it. Internal Affairs opened a case within hours. The complaint list was already serious. Excessive force, improper detention, questionable search, failure to assess the scene, failure to follow live threat information. Once military command was notified, local leadership lost control of the pace. Marcus was active duty Navy SEAL. That brought outside attention fast. NCIS made contact. City Legal got involved. Command staff understood the problem right away. One officer had detained the man who stopped the shooter and ignored the only useful tactical warning available at the time. Grayson tried to defend himself in his first interview. He said he had to secure an armed subject in a chaotic environment. That sounded better on paper than it looked on video. The footage showed a compliant man, a holstered weapon, witnesses yelling the truth, and repeated warnings being ignored. Then investigators checked Grayson's history. That opened another problem. He already had prior complaints tied to aggressive stops and force issues. None had ended his career before. Now they looked different. Instead of isolated incidents, they looked like a pattern. Quick escalation, poor judgment, need for control, weak reassessment once facts changed. That pattern mattered. The department first moved him off the street, then put him on leave. By then, the videos were already spreading. People understood the story fast. A man stopped a shooter. The first officer treated him like the suspect. Witnesses tried to correct it. The officer kept going. Then the truth came out. Marcus stayed quiet in public. Through counsel, he gave one controlled statement. He said he acted to protect civilians, attempted to assist responding officers, and was then subjected to unnecessary force and unlawful detention while providing threat information. That statement carried weight because the evidence matched it. Reviewers also focused on the shoulder injury. Medical records supported Marcus. The warning was on camera. Grayson had no good answer for that. The search became another issue. Marcus was compliant. He was identifying himself. Witnesses were confirming his role. Grayson was not working from a stable arrest with clear facts. He was digging deeper into a detention that was already going bad. Sergeant Ruiz also became important in the review. Her actions showed the scene could have been handled correctly. She arrived, read the situation, recognized the mistake, removed the cuffs, and redirected officers to the threat lead Marcus had raised. That made it harder for anyone to argue Grayson's conduct was unavoidable. It wasn't. By the end of the week, the department knew this case was heading toward discipline, public fallout, and a lawsuit. Federal attention was close. Marcus's lawyers were preparing. Grayson's record was under full review. The city was already calculating damage. And the worst part for Grayson still hadn't arrived. That came when the final findings landed. His past complaints were put next to this incident, and the department had to decide whether it would keep defending him or cut him loose. Internal Affairs finished its review with too much evidence stacked in one direction. Bodycam, mall video, witness statements, medical records, supervisor review, Ruiz's report, Marcus's statement. They all said the same thing. Grayson misread the scene, used unnecessary force, ignored clear witness information, ignored a medical warning, and disrupted the response by focusing on the wrong man. The department fired him, not quietly either. The official language was cleaner than the reality, but the result was clear. He was terminated for misconduct tied to use of force, failure to follow response standards, and conduct that exposed the department to major legal liability. Then the civil case hit. Marcus filed suit over unlawful detention, excessive force, and violation of his constitutional rights. His lawyers didn't need to build some dramatic theory. The footage did most of the work. He was compliant. His weapon was holstered. Witnesses were identifying him in real time. He was giving useful tactical information. Grayson ignored all of it and treated control like the mission. The city settled. That part usually tells you everything. Cities fight cases they think they can survive. They settle fast when the facts are toxic. Marcus received compensation for the shoulder injury, the unlawful detention, and the broader rights violations. The settlement also required policy review and updated training. The second subject lead stayed under investigation for months. Authorities never publicly claimed more than they could prove, but the review confirmed Marcus had raised a credible lead that should have been acted on immediately. That finding mattered because it locked in the bigger point. Grayson's conduct was not just bad policing, it interfered with a live emergency response. That became the lesson no one in the department could avoid. Training changed after that. Officers were retrained on active shooter arrival priorities, witness intake under stress, lawful handling of armed Good Samaritans, and the need to update decisions when facts change. Supervisors were also pushed harder on early warning review because Grayson's old complaints looked very different once they were placed next to this case. What had been treated as isolated attitude problems now looked like obvious warning signs. That embarrassed command staff too. Because this wasn't just one reckless officer, it was also a department that had seen smaller versions of the same behavior and failed to stop it early. Once federal attention and public pressure hit, that record became impossible to hide behind paperwork. Sergeant Ruiz came out of it with more credibility. Her actions didn't erase the damage, but they showed the scene could still be corrected once someone competent took over. That mattered in the final review. Marcus went back to duty after medical clearance. He didn't turn himself into a media figure. He didn't chase interviews. He made one clear statement and left it there. He said the shooter was not the only danger that day. The other danger was a responder who cared more about control than facts. That line stuck because it was true. And that's the whole point of this story. During emergencies, the badge means nothing without discipline. Panic plus ego is a threat by itself. A lawful armed citizen, a veteran, even an active operator, can still get treated like the enemy when the wrong officer shows up and stops thinking. Rights matter most in that moment, not after. What would you have done in that situation? Have you ever seen someone in authority make everything worse because they refuse to listen? Put it in the comments. Share the story with someone who still thinks bad policing is just a paperwork issue. And subscribe for more stories like this.
Step away from the pump. I'm telling you, this is official work.
Yeah, official for who?
Law enforcement. You need to slow down and verify before you touch anything here.
No, you need to explain why you pumping stolen fuel.
Stolen fuel? You haven't even checked
Don't
anything.
tell me what I checked.
Then check it.
ID, right now.
I already told you who I am. Call the supervisor and verify.
This is why you never let a badge replace facts. When a patrol officer rolled up on a black man at a gas station and accused him of stealing fuel, he expected fear, excuses, and quick compliance. What he got instead was a calm federal investigator in the middle of a sanctioned operation. And the second that truth came out, the officer knew he had pushed the wrong man in the worst possible place. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about profiling, abuse of power, and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. This started in the middle of a working investigation, not in the middle of some random misunderstanding. The man at the pump was Adrian Cole. He was a federal investigator, mid-40s, plain clothes, unmarked vehicle, active field assignment. He was tracking a fuel fraud case tied to stolen commercial card data and coordinated purchases across state lines. He wasn't there for gas on the way home. He was watching a target, logging movements, and waiting for the next step in the operation. The officer who turned it into a public scene was Tyler Boone, a city patrol cop who had a habit of acting first and sorting out facts later. He came into that station already convinced he was about to catch somebody. That confidence lasted right up until he understood who Adrian really was. The gas station sat near an interstate exit in a busy retail strip. Early evening, bright canopy lights, cars coming in and out, security cameras over the pumps in the storefront, a cashier inside. A few customers close enough to hear the officer's voice the moment he got loud. Boone spotted Adrian near the pump and locked onto him fast. He looked at the plainclothes, looked at the vehicle, saw a black man standing there, and decided he had a theft case before he asked a single useful question. He didn't start by checking the plate. He didn't ask station staff what was going on. He didn't approach like somebody trying to understand a situation. He walked in like he'd already written the report in his head. He got out of his cruiser and started giving commands right away. He accused Adrian of pumping stolen fuel. He demanded identification. He ordered him to keep his hands visible and stop moving. His tone wasn't controlled. It was aggressive from the start, the kind officers use when they want to dominate a scene before anyone can challenge them. Adrian didn't match that energy. He stayed steady. He kept his movements limited. He told Boone he was law enforcement and that the officer needed to verify before interfering any further. That should have slowed things down. It didn't. Boone took that response as defiance. He stepped closer and repeated the accusation like volume could make it true. He talked over Adrian. He acted like the issue was settled and all that remained was getting the suspect into cuffs. That was the first clear sign he cared more about control than procedure. Adrian tried again. He told Boone in a measured way that this was official work and that a supervisor needed to be contacted before Boone touched anything tied to the scene. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to stop a patrol officer from damaging an active operation. Boone pushed harder. He moved into Adrian's space and started using physical presence, the way some officers do when they think size and pressure will get them what facts haven't. He positioned himself between Adrian and the vehicle. He kept talking about theft. He started warning him about detention. He made it sound like force was the next step if Adrian didn't comply exactly the way Boone wanted. The problem for Boone was simple. Adrian didn't look like a thief trying to escape. He looked like a professional trying to keep a reckless officer from making a bigger mistake. Anyone who took 2 seconds to read the scene could see it. A customer near the next row of pumps raised a phone and started recording. Another followed. The cashier inside stopped pretending to be busy and watched through the glass. Boone either didn't notice or thought none of it would matter later. It mattered. Because once the scene was on camera, every bad decision had a timestamp. Boone still hadn't verified who Adrian was. He still hadn't called in the plate. He still hadn't checked whether another agency was working nearby. He just kept pressing the accusation. That wasn't good police work. That was ego mixed with profiling, and it was getting more obvious by the second. Adrian kept his voice level. He said enough to make clear that Boone was heading into territory he did not understand. He did not argue for the crowd. He did not start a shouting match. He gave the officer chances to back up and do this correctly. Boone didn't take them. A second patrol unit pulled in. The backup officer got out slower and read the situation better right away. He saw Adrian's posture. He saw Boone's aggression. He saw the phones out. He looked like he already understood the stop was going bad. Boone kept driving it in the wrong direction. He started talking about handcuffs, like he was already committed to making an arrest. That was the point where this stopped looking like a heated misunderstanding and started looking like liability. An officer had moved from accusation to threatened force without taking the basic steps to confirm identity. He had built the whole encounter on assumption. Adrian knew exactly what kind of officer he was dealing with by then. Not the careful kind. Not the disciplined kind. Boone was one of those patrol cops who treated being questioned as disrespect and treated calm behavior like a challenge to his authority. Then Boone noticed a document pouch Adrian had kept close to his side. That caught his attention immediately. He started focusing on it. Adrian shifted slightly to keep Boone from grabbing it, and Boone reacted like that movement proved criminal intent. He closed distance again, escalated his commands, and reached toward Adrian's arm as if he was about to force the issue. That was the moment this whole thing crossed from bad judgment into serious misconduct. Because Boone still believed he was handling a suspected thief at a gas pump. He had no idea he was about to put hands on a federal investigator in the middle of a sanctioned operation. And once that next second arrived, his whole attitude was going to collapse. Boone's hand had barely moved before Adrian stopped him with a clear warning and a tone that finally cut through the officer's noise. Adrian told him not to touch the pouch, not to touch the vehicle, and not to interfere with federal property. He said it like a man who knew exactly where the line was and knew Boone had already stepped too close to it. Boone didn't process the warning the way a careful officer would have. He heard the word federal and treated it like a bluff. That's what made this so bad. He'd built the whole encounter around his own first impression, and by now he was too deep into it to admit he might have been wrong. So instead of slowing down, he tried to overpower the situation before it slipped away from him. He told Adrian to stop talking. He said he was done with the excuses. He reached again, this time more openly, like he was going to seize the pouch and sort it out himself. Adrian moved one step back and brought the pouch forward just enough to control it, not enough to look combative. Then he opened it. That changed everything. Inside was a federal credential wallet and a signed operation packet. Not some cheap badge, not a novelty shield, real credentials. Agency seal, photo match, assignment paperwork. The kind of documents patrol officers are trained to stop and verify, not argue with in front of a crowd. Boone looked at them for a second and still tried to hold on to the stop. He said something about fake IDs and said anyone could print papers. Bad move, real bad. At that point, he wasn't investigating. He was resisting reality because reality made him look reckless. Adrian kept control of the scene better than Boone did, and that was obvious to everybody standing there. He held the credentials where Bodycam and phone cameras could catch them. He identified himself fully. He stated that he was engaged in a sanctioned operation. He told Boone to call his supervisor and verify through dispatch immediately. That second officer finally stepped in a little closer. Not enough to challenge Boone directly, but enough to show he understood the problem now. He looked at the credentials, then at Boone, and you could tell he wanted this to slow down before it got worse. Too late for that. Dispatch came over Boone's radio while he was still trying to talk over Adrian. The message wasn't loud enough for the whole station to hear every word, but it was loud enough for the important part. There was an interagency notification on file. Federal personnel were operating in the area. The location matched. Boone's face changed right there. Not all at once. First confusion. Then the quick blank look people get when they realize the story they've been telling themselves just fell apart. Then panic. Small at first, then obvious. Adrian didn't let him talk his way around it. He put the credentials back in the pouch, kept his posture steady, and told Boone he had been warned more than once to verify before escalating. He said Boone had interfered with an active operation, made a criminal accusation without confirming identity, and threatened force in a situation he did not understand. Now Boone started sounding different. The swagger dropped out of his voice. He said he was only responding to what looked suspicious. He said he was doing his job. He said Adrian could have identified himself sooner, like this had happened because the target of his aggression hadn't made it easy enough for him. That excuse died fast because everyone there had just watched Adrian do exactly that. More than once, calmly, clearly. Boone ignored it because he didn't want an answer. He wanted compliance from the person he'd already decided was guilty. Then Adrian's phone rang through the secure line clipped inside his jacket. It was his supervisor. He answered, gave his name, and put the call on speaker just long enough for the chain of command to enter the scene without ever stepping out of a vehicle. Supervisory Agent Lena Velez came on sharp and direct. She identified herself, confirmed Adrian's status, confirmed the operation, and asked for the patrol officer's name and badge number. That was the moment Boone fully understood. He was no longer managing a gas station stop. He was explaining himself to people above his pay grade, with witnesses, video, and radio traffic behind all of it. He gave his name, gave the badge number. His words came out slower now, less force, more caution. He tried one more version of the same defense, saying the situation looked like possible fuel theft, and he had to act quickly. Velez shut that down. She asked whether he had verified the vehicle before accusing Adrian. He hadn't. She asked whether he had contacted a supervisor before threatening detention of someone claiming law enforcement status. He hadn't. She asked whether he had made physical contact or attempted to seize federal documents. He started answering that one carefully, which told everyone enough. The backup officer looked like he wanted to disappear. The two customers were still recording. The cashier inside had moved closer to the glass. Boone could feel the audience now because the audience had stopped being useful to him. Adrian stayed measured. That's what made Boone look even worse. He wasn't being baited. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't trying to embarrass Boone for sport. He was documenting him in real time. Big difference. One man was trying to control himself. The other had already shown he couldn't control a routine contact. Then Velez told Boone to stop all interference, clear the scene, and wait for a supervisor, because her office would be making formal contact with the department before the hour was over. That landed. Boone nodded before catching himself and remembering she couldn't see him. Then he said he understood, quietly. Nothing like the man who had stormed in minutes earlier, acting like he owned the place. He stepped back from Adrian for the first time since this started. Really stepped back. Not tactical repositioning. Retreat. Adrian didn't chase the moment. He didn't pile on. He adjusted the pouch, checked the vehicle, and made sure nothing tied to the operation had been disturbed. Then he looked at Boone and said the part Boone was going to hear again in reports, reviews, and probably depositions. He said authority means nothing when procedure disappears. That line hit because it was true, and everybody there knew it. A field supervisor from Boone's department arrived a few minutes later and got the ugly version first. Phone video, Bodycam, dispatch confirmation, federal supervisor already involved. There was no room left for Boone to frame this as a close call or a confusing stop. The facts were too clean. The sergeant separated the officers, spoke briefly with Adrian, looked at the credentials, and his whole expression tightened. He knew what kind of paperwork was coming. He also knew this wasn't just about one bad interaction. This was a public example of an officer going aggressive before getting basic facts, and the profiling angle was impossible to ignore. Adrian gave a concise statement right there. He explained why he was at the station, how Boone approached, what warnings had been given, and exactly when Boone escalated to threats and attempted interference. He didn't need to embellish anything. The officer had done enough on his own. Boone stood off to the side trying to recover a version of himself that no longer fit the scene. He wasn't commanding anything now. He wasn't directing traffic, controlling hands, or throwing around accusations. He was just a patrol officer waiting for his supervisor to decide how much of his career he had burned in one stop. And the worst part for him was this. The whole thing had started because he saw a black man in plainclothes and trusted his own bias more than protocol. That truth was all over the footage. The fallout started before Boone even left the gas station. By the time his supervisor finished the first round of questions, the video was already moving. One customer posted a clip that showed the accusation, the threats, and the exact shift in Boone's voice after Adrian's credentials came out. Another angle showed Boone closing distance and reaching toward the document pouch after being warned to stop. That part mattered because it killed any later attempt to describe the encounter as calm or routine. Adrian went back to work that night, but the stop had already damaged the operation. Once a patrol officer creates a loud scene at an active surveillance location, the whole environment changes. People notice, targets notice, patterns break. The federal team had to shut down that phase early and review what had been compromised. That made Boone's mistake bigger than one bad street encounter. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had interfered with a live investigation. The next morning, Adrian filed a formal incident memorandum through his agency and attached everything available at that point. His own field notes, dispatch time markers, Bodycam preservation request, security camera request, witness information. He handled it the same way experienced investigators handle everything important. Clean timeline, no exaggeration, no emotional padding. Just facts lined up in order so nobody could hide inside confusion later. Boone's department didn't have much room to stall. The footage was public. The federal agency had already made contact. Internal Affairs opened an investigation the same week. Boone was put on administrative duty first, then moved off the street entirely, while the case was reviewed. The department tried the usual early language. They called it a concerning interaction. They said they were gathering facts. They promised a full review, standard damage control. The problem for them was that the facts were already visible, and the public could hear the officer making the wrong call in real time. Then more complaints surfaced. Not criminal cases, not huge headline scandals. Something more believable and more damaging. People from the same patrol area started describing Boone the same way. Quick to accuse, fast to escalate. Different tone depending on who he was talking to. More forceful with black drivers and pedestrians. Less patient when challenged. The kind of pattern departments ignore until one video makes it impossible to keep ignoring. Internal Affairs pulled Bodycam from unrelated stops. They reviewed dispatch logs. They looked at prior complaints that had gone nowhere. That part always tells the real story. One ugly incident usually doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a pattern someone tolerated. Adrian also moved on the civil side. He filed a civil rights claim centered on unlawful attempted detention, interference with federal duties, and discriminatory enforcement. He wasn't chasing drama. He was forcing the city to answer for what its officer had done in public with full documentation. His lawyers argued that Boone skipped basic identification steps and escalated based on appearance, not evidence. That claim got attention fast because the video backed it up better than any press release could. Boone, of course, tried to save himself. He gave a statement saying the vehicle looked suspicious, the conduct at the pump looked inconsistent, and the man involved did not immediately identify himself to his satisfaction. Weak defense. It put the problem right back on him. To his satisfaction is not a legal standard. Procedure is. Verification is. Supervisor notification is. Controlled escalation is. Boone had ignored all of that. The internal report came down hard. Investigators found that Boone made a criminal accusation before establishing basic facts, failed to verify identity through available channels, escalated to threats of force without sufficient cause, and attempted to interfere with credentials and operational materials after being told he was dealing with law enforcement. The report also flagged indicators of biased enforcement. They didn't need dramatic language. The sequence spoke for itself. He was suspended first. Then the department announced formal discipline and mandatory decertification review. His future on the job got shaky in a hurry. Once an officer is publicly tied to profiling, procedural failure, and dishonesty in judgment, every prosecutor, defense lawyer, and supervisor starts looking at him differently. That's the part some officers never think about when they're throwing their weight around in a parking lot. One bad stop can follow every case they ever touch after that. The city moved toward settlement talks on Adrian's claim before trial. Also not surprising. Cases like that get expensive, and video makes them worse. The legal risk wasn't just the stop itself. It was the department's exposure if the review showed Boone had a known pattern and stayed on the street anyway. Then came the policy changes. The department issued a revised contact protocol for disputed identity situations involving plainclothes personnel, task force work, and interagency operations. Officers now had to pause and verify through dispatch and a supervisor before escalating to detention when someone credibly claimed official status. They also expanded bias review triggers for complaints tied to stops that began with unsupported criminal assumptions. Training got updated too, but training only matters if supervisors enforce it. That's where the real lesson sat. This whole thing wasn't caused by lack of information. Boone had plenty of options. He could have checked the plate. He could have contacted dispatch before accusing. He could have asked for a supervisor when Adrian said he was law enforcement. He could have stopped reaching once he saw credentials. He chose none of that because he trusted his own ego more than the job. And that's why the scene blew up. Adrian didn't become a celebrity from it. He didn't tour TV studios or turn the stop into some performance. He kept working. He gave his statements. He let the record do its work. People in his field respected that because they know how rare it is for somebody to stay that controlled while an officer tries to bully him in public. The bigger effect landed closer to home. Officers in Boone's department now had an example nobody could laugh off. Supervisors had a case they had to reference. Community members had proof for something they'd been saying for years. And younger officers watching the story understood the point immediately. If you walk into a scene with bias and attitude, cameras will finish what your bad judgment starts. That's what this story came down to. A patrol officer saw a black man at a gas pump and thought he could force the facts to fit his first assumption. He pushed hard, got reckless, and found out too late that confidence doesn't protect you when procedure collapses. Adrian didn't beat him by getting louder. He beat him by staying disciplined, knowing the rules, and making sure the record stayed clean. That's the whole power game in situations like this. The loudest person usually thinks he's winning. Then the footage gets reviewed, the timeline gets built, and all that false authority starts looking real small. What would you have done in Adrian's position? Have you ever seen an officer go aggressive before even checking the facts? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
I asked you a question. Who are you and what are you doing here?
We already
Federal
told you.
law enforcement official business.
Then show me something I can actually verify.
There you go.
No, that's not enough.
Call it in then.
Don't tell me how to do my job.
Nobody's telling you anything. Verify it and move on.
No, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up and come
not
outside.
leaving
Then
this
you're
city.
obstructing.
This is why officers need to know the limits of their authority before they start throwing it around. When a patrol cop stormed into a roadside diner and tried to throw out two men he thought were suspicious drifters, he expected instant compliance. What he got instead was a calm refusal. 2 federal badges on the table, and the exact kind of public mistake that ends careers. Watch how fast the power shifted once his ego got ahead of his training. Before this goes any further, drop where you're watching from. City, state, country, wherever. And if you like stories about power trips getting checked by facts, hit like and subscribe. This one turned ugly fast, and it stayed ugly for the officer who caused it. This started in a diner that looked too ordinary for the kind of mess that was about to happen. It was late morning, local spot, highway traffic coming through, retirees at the counter, a waitress moving fast with coffee refills, a couple of truckers in a back booth. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. The kind of place where people notice strangers, but not enough to make a scene unless someone gave them a reason. 2 men had been sitting in a booth near the front windows for a while. Plain clothes, neutral jackets, no uniforms, no marked vehicles outside. They'd ordered coffee, something small to eat, and they'd barely touched either one after that. They weren't chatting much. They weren't staring at each other. They were watching the parking lot, the road, the entrance, and the reflection off the glass. People in that business always looked like they were doing nothing right up until it mattered. Those men were Deputy U.S. Marshals, Daniel Mercer and Elena Ruiz. They weren't there to eat. They were there because a fugitive tied to a federal warrant was expected to make contact in the lot outside. The diner gave them visibility, cover, and a believable reason to stay parked in one place without drawing attention. Standard surveillance choice: quiet, efficient, low profile. That was the plan. Then somebody in the diner decided the 2 quiet strangers looked wrong. It might have been a customer, might have been somebody behind the counter. Small towns do this all the time. Somebody sees 2 people sitting too long, not smiling enough, not acting familiar enough, and suddenly the whole thing becomes suspicious. Usually that goes nowhere. Sometimes an officer rolls by, asks a question, gets a simple answer, and moves on. That's what should have happened here. Instead, Officer Tyler Kessler walked in ready to dominate the room. He didn't come in curious. He came in aggressive. That mattered. The first few seconds told the whole story. He didn't scan the room and assess. He locked onto the booth immediately. Fast steps, hand already too close to his belt. Voice turned up for the audience. He wanted the room to know he had found the problem, and he was about to solve it. Mercer looked up once and knew what kind of officer this was. Not the cautious kind. Not the kind who asked himself what he might be missing. Kessler was the kind who decided first and investigated later. Bad habit in any job. Dangerous habit in law enforcement. Kessler stopped at the booth and started demanding answers. Identification. Purpose. Why they'd been sitting there. Why they were watching the entrance. Why the owner felt uncomfortable. He didn't ask those questions to gather facts. He asked them like he was already done listening. Mercer stayed seated. Ruiz stayed seated. Both of them kept it calm. They identified themselves as federal law enforcement engaged in official business. They told him there was no threat to the public and no need to disrupt the scene. They told him he could verify through proper channels if he needed confirmation. Clean, professional. Exactly what trained people say when they don't want to blow an active operation in front of a room full of civilians. Kessler didn't hear any of it the way it was said. He heard a challenge. That's where this went bad. Not because he was confused. Confusion can be fixed in 10 seconds. This was ego. He had walked in hot, and now he needed to prove he hadn't overplayed it. Officers like that get themselves in trouble because backing off feels worse to them than being wrong. Ruiz set her badge wallet where he could see it. Mercer did the same. Gold badges, federal credentials, not vague, not hidden, not some last-second reveal. They put the truth right in front of him and gave him a clean exit. All he had to do was pause, verify, lower his voice, and step out of the way. He didn't. He dismissed the badges almost instantly. Called them fake, or not good enough, or not relevant to what he called his scene. Different officers use different wording when they panic in public, but the move is always the same. Reject the evidence. Keep control of the moment. Don't let anybody see the doubt starting to creep in. The body camera would matter later because it caught that exact shift. You could see it. The second he realized they might actually be who they said they were, he got more forceful, not less. That's the tell. A disciplined officer slows down when uncertainty enters the picture. An insecure one speeds up. Mercer gave him another out. He repeated that verification could happen through dispatch. He explained in measured terms that they were on federal business and that removing them from the diner would interfere with an active investigation. Again, simple. Again, professional. Again, offering Kessler a chance to save face without blowing up the situation. Kessler took it personally. He started threatening obstruction. He started talking about trespass. He started acting like the diner booth was some kind of local battlefield where only his authority counted. That's what power trips look like in real time. They stop being about safety. They become emotional. The officer wants obedience more than accuracy, and the room felt it. Boom. The waitress stopped moving as fast. One of the truckers turned fully around in his seat. The owner looked nervous now, not because of the marshals, but because the officer had turned a manageable question into a public confrontation. A customer near the register started recording without making a show of it. Smart move. People have learned. When an officer comes in too loud and too certain, records matter. Mercer and Ruiz still didn't match his energy. That's another thing that made Kessler look worse. He was the only person escalating. The only person making it bigger. The only person refusing a normal off-ramp. He ordered them to stand up. They refused, not dramatically, not physically. They simply held position and repeated that they were engaged in official federal work and that his demand was improper. That kind of refusal hits an officer like Kessler harder than shouting ever could. He wanted a scene he could win. What he got was calm resistance backed by law, policy, and credentials he was too arrogant to verify. Then he made the mistake that changed the whole case. He radioed for backup and framed the situation like he was dealing with two non-compliant, suspicious subjects, possibly impersonating law enforcement. That was reckless for a few reasons. First, it contaminated the response. Now other officers were arriving with the wrong story in their heads. Second, it raised the stakes in a room full of civilians, while a federal surveillance operation was still active. Third, it created a recorded trail, dispatch logs, body cam, radio traffic, timestamps. Every bad decision now had a timestamp attached to it. Once that happens, cleanup gets hard. Ruiz tried one more time to stop the train before it hit the wall. She told him he was interfering with a marshal's operation. She told him he needed a supervisor before he made this worse. That wasn't a bluff. That was the last warning. Kessler didn't take it as a warning. He took it as disrespect. That was the moment his mask came off. He started talking like one of those officers who confuses a badge with ownership, like the town belonged to him, like jurisdiction was whatever he said it was. Like procedure only mattered when it protected his authority, not when it limited it. This happens more than departments like to admit. Training teaches one thing, ego teaches another. On a bad day, ego wins. And here's what made it even dumber. Mercer and Ruiz weren't trying to embarrass him. Not yet. They were trying to get through the assignment. They had no reason to flex, no reason to posture. The whole point of plainclothes surveillance is to stay invisible. Kessler forced the issue because he couldn't stand the idea that two quiet people at a diner didn't instantly answer to him. By the time the first backup unit pulled into the lot, the atmosphere inside had changed completely. Now it wasn't just a local officer bothering two strangers. Now it was a documented local federal confrontation inside a public business, with witnesses, video, radio traffic, and an officer who had already ignored visible credentials and doubled down anyway. That's when the real danger started. Because once more uniforms walked in, this could either get corrected immediately or become a career-ending disaster. And the person who decided that wasn't going to be Kessler anymore. It was going to be his supervisor. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach. The refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Haley let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement, active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly, no hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification. More than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene, pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His body cam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach, the refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Hale let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement. Active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly. No hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification more than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His body cam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover.
Fake credentials look fake to me. Don't try to fool me, you're under arrest.
They're valid. I identified myself. You still haven't told me what law I'm breaking.
I don't need fake credentials.
Fake? Come on, man.
Valid. Put your hands behind your back. You have
Want to
street
arrest
cred?
me? Because I'm black? That's why it seems suspicious to you?
This is why you need to know your rights. Officer Brandon Keller stopped a black man in uptown Charlotte and expected a quick, easy detention. What he got instead was a calm legal challenge from an FBI special agent who knew exactly what the officer could and could not do. The stop was recorded, reviewed, and it ended up exposing a pattern the department had ignored for years. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you follow stories about abuse of authority, legal accountability, and public exposure, like the video and subscribe. This started on a Friday evening in uptown Charlotte. The area was busy. Restaurants were filling up. People were heading to dinner, leaving offices, and moving through the sidewalks like they did every weekend. Daniel Navarro was one of them. He was walking to meet a colleague for dinner. He was not hiding, running, or bothering anyone. Brandon Keller stopped him anyway. Keller had been with the Charlotte Police Department for 6 years. By that point, he already had a history. Complaint after complaint had followed him, many tied to aggressive stops and profiling concerns. The department had noticed. That much became clear later. But instead of removing him from patrol or treating the pattern like a serious warning, supervisors kept giving him light corrections and sending him back out. That matters because this stop did not come out of nowhere. Keller had done versions of this before. He had already learned that the department was not going to stop him in any real way. When Keller approached Navarro, he demanded identification and claimed Navarro matched a vague description. That was the reason he gave. But he did not clearly explain what crime had happened, what specific suspect he was looking for, or what Navarro had done to justify being detained. Navarro did not argue for the sake of arguing. He stayed calm and asked the right question. He asked what law he was breaking. Keller did not have a clear answer. That should have ended the stop. It should have forced Keller to step back and move on. Instead, he pushed forward. He repeated the demand for identification and acted like the stop was already justified just because he had started it. Navarro still did not give him the reaction he wanted. He did not get loud. He did not panic. He did not give Keller anything he could use later to make the stop look reasonable. He stayed controlled and kept the issue where it belonged. What was the legal reason for the detention? Then Navarro identified himself as an FBI special agent. He showed valid credentials, real credentials. That gave Keller a chance to correct himself. He could have checked them, realized he had gone too far, and ended the encounter before it got worse. He did not do that. Keller said the credentials were fake. That was the point where the stop moved from questionable to serious. A local officer had stopped a man without clear cause, failed to explain the legal basis, and then refused to accept valid federal credentials, because backing down would mean admitting he had been wrong. Keller then grabbed Navarro and tried to force the stop into an arrest. People nearby started paying attention. It was a public sidewalk in a busy part of the city. A confrontation like that was not going to stay unnoticed. Witnesses slowed down. Some stopped completely. Then phones came out. That changed the situation. Once bystanders started recording, Keller was no longer just dealing with Navarro. He was creating a record of his own conduct. His words, his tone, his lack of justification, the physical escalation. All of it was now being captured by people who had no reason to protect him. Navarro stayed composed. That was important. Keller was trying to control the scene through pressure. Navarro kept forcing the issue back to the law. He had done nothing suspicious. Keller could not explain a valid basis for detention. The credentials were real. The arrest attempt had no legal support. The more Keller pushed, the worse it looked. And this was not just about one bad decision in one moment. The reason this incident mattered so much is that Keller had already built a pattern. Internal records later showed he had received 11 complaints in 6 years. Many involved similar stops of black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. Same kind of target, same kind of setting, same aggressive approach. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern. They just had not acted in a meaningful way. That background was not visible to the crowd on the sidewalk yet, but it was already part of the story. Keller was acting like a man who had been allowed to do this before. Then Sergeant Linda Mercer arrived. She stepped into a scene that was already tense and already public. She saw Keller, Navarro, the witnesses, and the phones recording. She checked the credentials. She looked at what witnesses had captured. It did not take long to understand that Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis, and then escalated after being challenged. At that point, Keller's version was falling apart in real time. Sergeant Linda Mercer did not treat it like a misunderstanding. She treated it like a scene that needed to be checked fast and documented correctly. She looked at Navarro's credentials herself. They were valid. She listened to the basic sequence of events. She checked what witnesses had already recorded. The problem was obvious. Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis, rejected valid identification, and escalated to physical force when he could not justify the detention. Mercer shut it down. She ordered Keller away from Navarro and took control of the stop. That mattered. Keller had been trying to keep the situation inside his own version of events. Mercer broke that immediately. Once another supervisor stepped in, checked the credentials, and saw the witness video, Keller lost control of the scene. Navarro was released there on the spot. That ended the street confrontation, but it started the real problem for the department. By that point, several bystanders had clear footage. It showed Navarro staying calm. It showed Keller pressing the stop without explaining a valid reason. It showed the situation getting worse instead of better after Navarro identified himself. Keller had no clean way to explain that video. The department did not have a clean way to defend it either. Keller was suspended almost immediately. That quick suspension told its own story. Departments usually move fast only when the facts are bad, public, and easy to understand. This one checked all three boxes. A federal agent had been stopped without cause in a busy part of Charlotte. Witnesses had recorded it. A supervisor had confirmed on scene that the credentials were real. There was no room to turn it into a vague internal dispute. Then the background started coming out. Once internal reviewers and city attorneys looked deeper, they found that Keller was not a surprise problem. He was a repeated problem. He had already collected 11 complaints in 6 years. Many of those complaints involved stops with the same basic pattern: black professionals, upscale or business districts, weak reasons for detention, aggressive behavior once challenged. That changed the meaning of the whole incident. Now, it was not just about one officer making one unlawful stop. It was about why he was still in position to do it after so many warnings. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern long before Navarro was stopped in uptown Charlotte. Internal records showed that leadership knew Keller's name, knew the complaint history, and knew the types of allegations tied to him. They responded with minor training and no serious discipline. That is how departments create their own scandals. They do not always create them by defending bad conduct after the fact. Sometimes they create them much earlier by tolerating it over and over until the wrong officer picks the wrong target in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Keller had picked the worst possible target for a bad stop. Navarro was not just someone who knew his rights in a general sense. He worked in federal law enforcement. He understood detention standards. He understood how reports get written. He understood how civil rights cases are built. He also understood that a calm record is stronger than an angry argument. So he did what experienced people do when a system shows its hand. He documented everything and moved it to a forum where Keller could not control the facts. The witness video spread quickly, first local, then wider. People in Charlotte started reacting not just to the stop itself, but to the pattern behind it. Black professionals spoke about similar encounters. Residents recognized the location type immediately. Upscale areas, business areas, places where certain officers treated black presence as suspicion by default. That public reaction mattered because it showed the department was dealing with more than one complaint from one victim. The video gave other people a reference point. It made older complaints look less isolated and more credible. Once that happens, leadership loses one of its favorite excuses. They can no longer pretend each case stood alone. Inside the department, supervisors had another problem. Mercer's intervention had made it harder to bury the details. This was not an incident where everyone on scene backed Keller's version. A sergeant had already stepped in, checked the credentials, and seen that Keller's basis for the stop did not hold together. That meant the city would have to account not only for what Keller did, but for what Mercer had already recognized in real time. And once lawyers got involved, that became very expensive. Because civil rights cases do not stop at the officer if the facts show a pattern. They move up. They ask who knew. They ask when they knew it. They ask what they did after repeated complaints. They ask why an officer with that record was still on patrol doing the same kind of stop. Those questions are harder for a department to answer than the stop itself. Navarro filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Keller, Keller's supervisors, and the Charlotte Police Department. That filing forced the issue out of internal language and into legal language. Internal language gives departments space. Legal language strips that away. A complaint is no longer a workplace matter or a training issue. It becomes a record of alleged constitutional violations, supervisory failure, and institutional neglect. The city then had to look at the full risk. Not just the video, not just Keller's actions, the history, the prior complaints, the notice to supervisors, the failure to intervene earlier, the public setting, the credibility of the victim, the fact that Mercer had confirmed the stop was wrong before the scene even ended. That is where the department's real exposure was sitting. Keller had created the incident. Leadership had created the conditions for it to happen again and again. That is the part many departments hate the most, because it is harder to isolate. Firing one officer later does not erase years of warnings. It does not erase ignored complaint patterns. It does not erase decisions by supervisors who saw the risk and kept him on patrol anyway. By then, Keller's career was already collapsing. Suspension was only the start. The evidence against him was too direct, and his history made it worse instead of softer. What might have been called a disputed stop in another case now looked like part of a documented pattern, and the department could see where this was headed. The department could see where it was headed, but by then it was too late to contain it. Navarro's lawsuit put the whole chain under pressure. Not just Keller, his supervisors too. The complaint argued that Keller violated Navarro's civil rights during the stop, then tried to force an arrest without legal grounds. It also went after the people above him for allowing an officer with a known pattern of misconduct to stay on patrol. That second part was the real danger for the city. A bad stop by one officer is damaging. A bad stop tied to years of ignored warnings is worse. Once internal records showed Keller had already drawn 11 complaints in 6 years, the issue got much bigger than one Friday night in uptown Charlotte. The case now had a timeline. It had repeated notice. It had a pattern supervisors had every chance to address and chose not to stop in any serious way. That is how the city ended up settling. The settlement was $4 million. Cities do not pay that kind of money because of a simple misunderstanding. They pay when the facts are hard to defend, the record is bad, and the risk of going further is even worse. In this case, the city was looking at witness video, a federal agent with valid credentials, a stop with no clear legal basis, an attempted arrest that did not hold up, and a complaint history that made Keller impossible to describe as an isolated problem. Keller was fired. He also lost his certification, which ended his ability to work in law enforcement again. That part mattered. Departments sometimes remove officers quietly and leave the door open for them to land somewhere else. This case did not end that way. Keller did not just lose one job. He lost the authority that came with the badge. But the story did not stop with him, and it should not. Keller was the visible problem. The deeper problem sat above him. Supervisors had already seen enough to act. They had the complaints. They had the recurring allegations. They had the location pattern, the type of stops, and the repeated accusations involving black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. They knew enough to understand the risk. They chose soft responses anyway. That failure became part of the public reckoning. The fallout forced changes inside the department. Complaint review systems were tightened, so repeated allegations could not be brushed aside as separate, unrelated incidents. Early warning tracking was strengthened to flag officers who kept drawing the same types of complaints. Outside oversight was added so the department was not left to police its own patterns in private. Public reporting requirements were also put in place, which made it harder to bury warning signs behind internal language. That is what real pressure does. It forces systems to create records they cannot easily hide later. And this is the point people should pay attention to. Keller did not suddenly become reckless on the night he stopped Navarro. He had been given room to operate like that for years. The stop in uptown Charlotte became a scandal because it finally happened in a setting the department could not control. Wrong target, public location, witnesses recording, immediate supervisory review, federal lawsuit, financial consequences. That combination forced honesty. Navarro's role in that mattered too. He did not save himself by shouting louder than Keller. He did not try to win the moment with attitude. He stayed controlled, stayed clear, and kept the issue tied to the law. Then he moved the fight to the place where records, patterns, and accountability mattered more than one officer's version of events. That is usually where these cases are really decided. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the first report. In the record that follows. By the end of it, Keller lost his career. The city paid millions. The department was pushed into reforms it should have made long before Navarro was ever stopped. And the public got a clear view of what the real issue was. Not one bad choice by one officer on one night. A system saw repeated misconduct, recognized the pattern, and let it continue until exposure made inaction impossible. That is the lesson here. A lot of abuse survives because institutions protect it through delay, excuses, and weak internal discipline. It keeps going until somebody documents it well enough, challenges it clearly enough, and forces the cost into public view. That is what happened here. So, what would you have done in Navarro's position? Have you ever seen a situation where an official kept pushing only because they were used to nobody stopping them? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.